Welcome to the Ghastly Journal, where into the darkest corners of history's most disturbing tales we delve. I'm your host, and today, the chilling legacy of a family whose practices defied not only social norms but perhaps the very laws of nature itself is what we're exploring. The story of the Halberts is this, a family who their dead never buried. Before we begin, a warning I should give you. What you're about to hear may disturb you. For the faint of heart, the tale of the Halberts is not. So, dim your lights, lock your doors, and for one of the most unsettling stories we've ever shared on this channel, prepare yourself. In the remote highlands of Scotland in the late 1700s, the Halbert family first appeared in historical records. A peculiar man was said to be the patriarch Magnus Halbert, reclusive, stern, and possessing unusual beliefs about life and death. Their home became the small village of Blackmore, nestled between craggy mountains and dense forests. A place shrouded in mist and mystery it was, where superstition ran as deep as the ancient roots of the towering pine trees that surrounded it. From Edinburgh, Magnus had fled with his wife Eleanor and their 3 children, William, Charlotte, and young Thomas, after a series of bizarre incidents left them unwelcome in the city. What exactly happened in Edinburgh remains unclear, but whispers suggested that fringe scientific experiments which crossed moral boundaries were what Magnus had been involved in. Upon arriving in Blackmore, a vast estate on the outskirts of the village was purchased by Magnus. A looming structure of dark stone and narrow windows, the manor house stood atop a hill overlooking the village below. Ravencrest Manor was what the locals called it, though the Halberts simply referred to it as home. For the villagers to notice the peculiarities of their new neighbors, it didn't take long. Rarely did the Halberts venture into the village except for occasional supplies. Despite the size of their estate, no local help did they employ. Most strikingly, they were never seen attending church services, a significant deviation from social norms of the time. But these oddities paled in comparison to what was discovered later. In the winter of 1798, tragedy struck the Halbert family when a mysterious fever befell Eleanor. To Ravencrest, the local physician, Dr. Sullivan, was summoned. Upon his arrival, to Eleanor's bedchamber, Magnus led him, where she lay pale and motionless. "I fear we may be too late, doctor," Magnus said, his voice devoid of emotion. Eleanor was examined by Dr. Sullivan, and what Magnus already knew was confirmed. She had passed away. His condolences were offered by the doctor and he began discussing funeral arrangements as was customary. "That won't be necessary," Magnus interrupted, his tone sharp and final. Confused, the matter was pressed by Dr. Sullivan, explaining the importance of proper burial. "The Halberts do not bury their dead, doctor," Magnus stated firmly. "With her family where she belongs, Eleanor will remain." Disturbed but unsure how to respond, that night, Dr. Sullivan left Ravencrest, troubled by the strange encounter. The following day, with the local minister, Reverend Clark, he returned, hoping to reason with Magnus about the importance of a Christian burial. When they arrived, entry was refused by Magnus. Through the partly open door, something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives was caught a glimpse of by the 2 men. Eleanor's body, dressed in a fine gown, was seated at the dining table as if she were still alive, with the family gathered around her as if nothing had changed. Horrified that Magnus show proper respect for his wife's remains was demanded by Reverend Clark. Chilling was Magnus' response. "Death is merely a transition, Reverend. Long after the heart stops beating, the body houses the essence. To bury her would be to sever that connection permanently. To the cold earth, we will not abandon her." Quickly through Blackmore, news of this macabre situation spread. The villagers, already wary of the strange family on the hill, now regarded them with outright fear and suspicion. That the authorities intervene was demanded by some, while others were too frightened to even speak of the matter. Sheriff Douglas Mercer, the county's representative of law and order, visited Ravencrest to investigate the disturbing reports. When confronted, documents were presented to him by Magnus, old yellowed pages covered in strange symbols and archaic language. "This is our family covenant," Magnus explained, dating back centuries. Their dead close have the Halberts always kept. It is our tradition, our birthright. Though deeply unsettled, nothing in the law that explicitly prohibited a family from keeping a deceased relative in their home was found by Sheriff Mercer, provided there was no public health risk. Reluctantly, without taking action, he left Ravencrest, but warned Magnus that he would be watching the situation closely. As months passed, in the Halbert home, Eleanor's body remained. The few visitors who were ever admitted reported seeing her in various rooms of the house. Regularly, her position changed as if she were still participating in family life. Sometimes seated by the fireplace with needlework in her lifeless hands, other times positioned at the piano, her stiff fingers resting on the keys. More disturbing still were the accounts from those who claimed to have seen Magnus speaking to Eleanor's corpse, apparently convinced that some part of her could still hear him. To their mother's continued presence, the children's reactions varied. William, the eldest at 16, seemed to have adopted his father's beliefs entirely, treating his mother's corpse with the same reverence he had shown her in life. Charlotte, 13, was visibly distressed by the situation, but obedient to her father's wishes she remained. Young Thomas, only 8, reportedly asked visitors when his mother would wake up, suggesting he didn't fully comprehend what had happened. For 2 years, this macabre arrangement continued, with Eleanor's preserved body remaining a central figure in the Halbert household. Some method of preservation that prevented the typical decay had apparently been found by Magnus, though the exact technique remained his closely guarded secret. Then in the autumn of 1800, another tragedy befell the family. William, while hunting in the dense forest surrounding Ravencrest, suffered a fatal accident when his rifle misfired. Back to the manor, his body was carried by his distraught father and siblings. Just as with Eleanor, William was not buried. Instead, in the family's growing tableau of death, his preserved body was placed. Witnesses described seeing William's corpse positioned in his favorite armchair in the library, a book eternally open in his stiff hands. By this point, with the Halberts, the villagers of Blackmoor had developed a complex relationship. While most avoided the family entirely, viewing their practices as an abomination against God and nature, others became morbidly fascinated. Some even claimed that some secret knowledge about death had been discovered by the Halberts, that perhaps something about the afterlife that others did not was known by the family. These rumors gained traction when people began reporting strange lights emanating from Ravencrest at odd hours of the night, accompanied by unusual sounds that some described as unearthly chanting. More troubling were the accounts from shepherds who claimed to have seen figures moving on the grounds of Ravenrest in the dead of night, figures that moved stiffly and unnaturally. Around Magnus Halbert, a small cult of personality began to form in the village. A handful of locals drawn to the mystery and the suggestion of arcane knowledge started to visit Ravencrest regularly. With stories that only added to the family's mystique, they returned. Tales of Magnus conducting strange rituals in the presence of his deceased wife and son, of ancient texts filled with forgotten wisdom, and of experiments that challenged the very boundary between life and death. One such visitor was Emily Sutton, a young woman who had recently lost her husband to consumption. Desperate to maintain some connection to her beloved, she sought out Magnus, hoping to learn his methods of preservation. One of the most detailed descriptions of the Halberts' peculiar lifestyle is provided by Emily's account of her visit to Ravencrest. According to her journal, which was discovered years later, the interior of Ravenrest was unlike anything she had expected. "The manor is not a house of mourning," she wrote, "but rather a place where death and life exist in unsettling harmony. Throughout the home, the deceased Halberts are positioned as if they were still participating in daily life. Eleanor at her needlework. William with his books. Magnus speaks to them, sets places for them at the table, and treats them as if they were merely silent, not absent. Most disturbing of all is the children's acceptance of this arrangement. To her mother's corpse, Charlotte reads aloud, while at his brother's feet, young Thomas plays. What should be impossible to accept, they have normalized. As charismatic and articulate, Emily described Magnus, a man who spoke of death not as an end, but as a temporary inconvenience. His laboratory he showed her, a large room in the east wing of the manor filled with strange equipment, bottles of chemicals, and journals documenting his work. That the soul remains tethered to the body for far longer than conventional wisdom suggests, Magnus believes, Emily wrote. Of death as a door that swings both ways, he speaks and hints that under the right circumstances, that door might be reopened. Whether driven by grief or genuinely convinced by Magnus' theories, a regular visitor to Ravencrest became Emily. In his work, she began assisting Magnus, becoming something of an apprentice. From this period, her journal entries become increasingly erratic, filled with cryptic references to the threshold and the return. Indefinitely, the situation at Ravencrest might have continued had it not been for the events of the winter of 1803. A particularly harsh season had isolated Blackmoor from neighboring towns for weeks. Food was scarce and through the village, illness was spreading. When during a blizzard, 3 children from the village went missing, search parties were organized. The missing children were not found, but to a shocking discovery on the grounds of Ravencrest, the search led. Behind the manor, partially concealed by the snow, a small building that had not been there before was found by searchers, a stone structure with no windows and a heavy iron door. From within came a foul odor and sounds that one searcher described as neither human nor animal, but something in between. Entry was demanded by Sheriff Mercer, leading the search party. When Magnus refused, by force, the door was broken down. What they found inside defies easy explanation. Several metal tables were contained in the room, each bearing a body in various states of what can only be described as reconstruction. Body parts that appeared to belong to different individuals had been stitched together. Most horrifying of all, some of these composite forms showed signs of movement, twitching and jerking as if animated by some unknown force. In one corner, barely recognizable as once having been human, were the remains of what the searchers believed to be the missing children. Immediately, Magnus was arrested along with Emily Sutton, who was found assisting him. Into protective custody, Charlotte and Thomas were taken, both children appearing malnourished and in a state of shock. Thoroughly, Ravencrest was searched. In addition to Eleanor and William's preserved bodies, the remains of at least 7 other individuals were discovered throughout the manor. All preserved through Magnus methods, and positioned as if they were still living occupants of the home. In Magnus' laboratory, journals detailing his experiments, his attempts to reverse death itself were found by authorities. A man obsessed with the idea that death was not final was revealed by the writings, that with the right application of science and what he called the old knowledge, the dead could be restored. Brief and closed to the public was the trial of Magnus Halbert and Emily Sutton. In official records, the specific charges were never made entirely clear, perhaps because the nature of their crimes defied existing legal categories. What is known is that both were found guilty and sentenced to death. The night before their scheduled execution, something occurred that has never been adequately explained. In the morning, the jail where Magnus and Emily were being held was found empty. From the outside, the cells were locked. The guards were at their posts, and during the night, no one had seen or heard anything unusual. The prisoners had simply vanished. That the preserved bodies of Eleanor and William had disappeared as well was revealed by a search of Ravencrest. The other bodies found in the manor remained, but without a trace. The Halberts, both living and dead, were gone. The most disturbing twist in this already macabre tale came 3 days later when a shepherd reported seeing 5 figures moving across the moors in the early morning mist, a tall man, a woman, 2 children, and what appeared to be an adolescent boy. With the same stiff, unnatural gait, all 5 moved. This was the last confirmed sighting of the Halbert family in Blackmoor. Eventually, Ravencrest Manor was abandoned, with no one willing to purchase or occupy a home with such a grim history. Over time, the elements reclaimed the structure until only ruins remained as a testament to the family who had once lived and perhaps never died there. But with their disappearance from Blackmoor, the story of the Halberts did not end. Over the subsequent decades, from various parts of Britain and later Europe, reports emerged of a strange family who never seemed to age and who were never seen burying their dead. In 1837, his encounter with a family named Halford, who had recently moved to the area, was documented by a physician in a small village in northern France. To their home, he was called to attend to an elderly woman who had apparently suffered a stroke. Upon arriving, he found the woman clearly deceased. Yet her death was refused to be acknowledged by the family, insisting she was merely in a deep sleep. That other members of the family, particularly the patriarch, moved in an unusual manner was noted by the physician, as if their joints had forgotten how to bend properly. When local authorities investigated, the family had vanished, leaving behind only a strange chemical odor in their abandoned home. Throughout the 19th century in Germany, Austria, and as far east as Romania, similar accounts appeared. The details varied, but common elements emerged: a family with an unusual fixation on preserving their dead, strange experiments conducted in secret, and an unnatural manner of movement among the family members. By the early 20th century, something of a legend among occultists and those interested in the macabre had become the story of the Halberts. That Magnus had discovered the secret of immortality, but at a terrible cost, was claimed by some, a half-life of perpetual decay held at bay only through his mysterious preservation techniques. That the Halberts had never been entirely human to begin with was suggested by others, that they were something older and stranger that had merely adopted human guise. The most credible later chapter in the Halbert saga came in 1923 when a private detective named Richard Thornton was hired to investigate a reclusive family living in an isolated manor house in the Carpathian Mountains. His client, a wealthy businessman, had become concerned after his daughter became involved with the family's son. A family of 5 who matched descriptions of the Halberts in many respects as described in Thornton's detailed report, discovered among his effects after his death in 1927. Most notably, he observed that while they claimed the elderly woman living with them was the family matriarch, she never spoke, never ate, and was frequently repositioned around the house like a piece of furniture. Abruptly, Thornton's investigation ended when he was discovered attempting to photograph the family. Severely beaten, he was warned never to return. "I cannot say with certainty that these are the infamous Halberts of Blackmore," he wrote in his report, "but if they are not, then their spiritual successors in every way that matters they are. The same miasma of death postponed rather than conquered, of natural law defied, but not without consequence, they carry." After Thornton's encounter, the trail of the Halberts goes cold. If they continued their nomadic existence throughout the 20th century, they apparently became more cautious about drawing attention to themselves. However, in 2006, an interesting discovery was made during the renovation of an old house in Prague. Hidden within a sealed wall cavity, a collection of journals and scientific notes dating from the mid-9th century was found by workers. The papers, written in an archaic form of English, detailed experiments in human preservation and animation that bore striking similarities to the methods attributed to Magnus Halbert. Most intriguing was a family photograph found among the papers. Though faded and damaged, it showed 5 figures: a stern-looking man, a woman with a vacant expression, 2 children, and a teenage boy. All were dressed in clothing from the late Victorian era, but the photograph itself appeared to have been taken much later, possibly in the 1930s or 1940s based on the photographic technique used. Several disturbing details were noted by experts who examined the photograph. The subject's skin had an unusual waxy appearance, their postures were oddly rigid, even by the standards of early photography when subjects had to remain still for extended periods. Most telling was the woman's eyes, which appeared to be glass replacements rather than natural. By a private collector, the papers and photograph were acquired before they could be properly studied by authorities, and their current whereabouts are unknown. In the decades since, in obscure corners of the internet, rumors and unconfirmed sightings of the Halberts have continued to surface occasionally. A strange family living in abandoned buildings is claimed to have been encountered by urban explorers. A group of people who moved unnaturally and spoke in archaic English is reported to have been met by hikers in remote areas. To abandoned addresses, unusual bulk orders of preservation chemicals are noted by medical supply companies. None of these accounts can be verified, of course. The story of the Halberts, a family who refused to bury their dead and who may have discovered something terrible about the nature of death itself, remains primarily in the realm of legend. Yet, one has to wonder, if not just the body, but something of the essence of a person after death was truly found to be preserved by Magnus Halbert, what would that mean for his family? Indefinitely, would they continue their macabre existence, neither truly alive nor properly dead, moving from place to place as decades and eventually centuries passed? Would they continue to add to their family, preserving each member as they succumb to injury or illness or age, creating an ever-growing procession of the animated dead? And if they do still exist in some form, what would they look like now after more than 2 centuries of their unnatural existence? How much of their humanity would remain? Those who have studied the Halbert case over the years have been fascinated and disturbed by these questions. Whatever the truth may be, a chilling reminder of the dangers of defying the natural order is served by the story of the family who never buried their dead, of the fine line between devotion and obsession, and of the potentially terrible consequences of refusing to accept the finality of death. Before we conclude this dark chapter of history, I should note that while the story of the Halberts contains many verifiable elements, from second-hand accounts, rumor, and folklore comes much of what we know. With certainty, the full truth of what occurred at Ravencrest Manor and what became of the family afterward may never be known. What we can say is that a long shadow continues to be cast by the legacy of the Halberts. In Blackmoor, now a much larger town than it was in Magnus' day, the ruins of Ravencrest are still avoided by locals. To spend the night among the crumbling walls, children dare each other, but few are brave enough to accept the challenge. Those who do often return with wild tales of whispering voices and the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. Numerous works of fiction have also been inspired by the story, from Victorian penny dreadfuls to modern horror films. A powerful motif in the Gothic tradition has become the image of the family who keeps their dead as if they were still living. Perhaps most unsettling are the periodic reports from around the world of families attempting to replicate the Halberts' practices. As recently as 2018, in a small town in Eastern Europe, the bodies of their deceased children and grandchildren were discovered preserved by authorities from an elderly couple, keeping them positioned throughout their home as if they were still alive. When questioned, the Halbert method was referenced by the couple, and claimed to have learned it from a stranger who had visited their village years earlier. For those interested in exploring this story further, fact from fiction in the Halbert case has been attempted to be separated by several academic works. Perhaps the most thorough examination of the scientific principles that might have informed Magnus preservation techniques is provided by Dr. Elizabeth Montgomery's The Thanatology of Magnus Halbert, Science, Superstition, and the Boundaries of Death. Within the broader context of 19th-century attitudes toward death and mourning, the Halberts are placed by Professor James Harker's Ravencrest, a study in historical horror. In our online shop, both works are available along with reproductions of some of the Halbert family documents that have survived to the present day. And now, as we close this chapter of the Ghastly Journal, I leave you with a final unsettling thought. What if the Halbert story isn't merely a historical curiosity or a cautionary tale? What if somewhere in the world, a family of 5 continues their eternal procession through time, adding to their numbers as necessity dictates, never burying their dead because in some terrible way their dead have never truly died? If you're interested in supporting our channel and helping us continue to bring these obscure historical horrors to light, please consider becoming a patron. Deeper into the archives allows us to delve your support and uncover even more chilling tales from the shadows of history. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's most macabre mysteries. Sleep well and remember, not all family traditions are meant to be preserved. But wait, before you go, one last detail I should share with you. During my research for this episode, a curious listing on an obscure online marketplace specializing in antiques and historical artifacts was come across by me. The item in question was a small leather-bound journal allegedly belonging to Charlotte Halbert, dated 1847, nearly 50 years after the family's disappearance from Blackmoor. Within hours of being posted, the listing was removed, and my attempts to contact the seller were unsuccessful. However, the single page that had been photographed as part of the listing, I was able to save. Consistent with early Victorian penmanship appears the handwriting analyzed by experts, and to the mid-9th century, the paper and ink have been tentatively dated. The visible text reads as follows: "Father says we must move again." About mother, the neighbors have begun to ask questions: why she never joins them for tea, why only through the windows she is ever seen. trouble was caused by William yesterday when into the village he ventured. Despite father's best efforts, his movements are becoming more erratic. As well as the old one did, the new formula isn't working. Of us all, Thomas is the worst now. Since his accident, it has been almost 20 years, and with each passing year, less effective seem father's preservation techniques. The powder we use to conceal them, the stitches across Thomas's neck have begun to show through. At all, his left arm no longer moves. Father himself is changing. Sometimes at nothing, I catch him staring. Just like mother's, his eyes vacant. That the formula as well he has been taking, I fear. Though he is still breathing, still eating, still speaking of his great work. As I was, I alone remain, though for how much longer I cannot say. These past weeks, strangely, father has been watching me. In hand, syringe, standing over my bed at night, I found him, murmuring about preventative measures. For America, tomorrow we leave. That we will find greater freedom there to continue his work, father believes. Of vast empty spaces where we can exist without scrutiny, he speaks. To go, I am not sure I want. But then, a choice anymore I'm not sure I have. Since that winter night in 1803 when to my room father came and told me it was time for me to help preserve our family legacy, I'm not sure I've had a choice. Of Blackmore, sometimes I dream, of a proper burial in consecrated ground, of rest. But such dreams are dangerous. When I've had them, father always knows. That it means I'm slipping away, he says, and that soon to remain with the family, I'll need his help. That day is coming soon, I fear. In the mornings, my hands have begun to stiffen. The same waxy pallor that William developed before his transition is shown by my reflection. For me in our new home across the ocean, a special room has been preparing by father. If after I'm gone, this journal is found by anyone, or rather after I have changed, know that still the earth is walked by the Halberts, neither living nor dead. And if a family of unusual stillness you should see, their movements mechanical, their eyes never quite focusing on what they observe, run. Run and hope that they have not noticed. Of course, the authenticity of this document cannot be verified. An elaborate hoax created by someone familiar with the Halbert legend it may well be. But if it is genuine, a chilling glimpse into the continuation of the family's story long after they vanished from Scotland it provides. And another perhaps even more disturbing possibility it raises, that not only their dead the Halberts preserved, but that to the living as well, Magnus eventually began to administering his treatments to family members before natural death could claim them, creating a family suspended in some terrible state between life and death. A new development in their story is the notion that the Halberts may have reached American shores. If to be believed is Charlotte's journal, in the mid-9th century, the family arrived in the United States sometime. The relative lack of reported sightings in Europe during the later Victorian era, this could explain. From that period, American records, particularly in frontier regions, were often sparse and unreliable. A strange family settling in a remote area might have escaped official documentation entirely. However, from various regions, local folklore includes tales of the Stiff family or the Walking Dead folks that share certain similarities with the Halbert case. From a small mining town in Colorado, circa 1870, comes one such account. According to local newspaper archives, an abandoned mine and the surrounding property was purchased by a family named Halford, converting part of the mine into what they called private research facilities. To themselves, the family kept, but for specific tasks related to the renovation of the mine, occasionally hired local men. One such worker, upon returning to town after several days at the Halford property, claimed to have seen something disturbing in a sealed section of the mine, what he described as people who ain't people no more, standing still as statues, but sometimes twitching like they're trying to remember how to move. As drunk or delirious, the man was dismissed. But when to investigate, a small group of townspeople went, completely abandoned was found the Halford property with evidence of a hasty departure. In a hidden room cut into the rock, chemical equipment was discovered by them, journals written in code, and most disturbing of all, a collection of glass eyes of various colors, some still bearing traces of human tissue. In other isolated communities across America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, similar stories emerged. A family in the bayou of Louisiana who were said to move like marionettes, a reclusive group in the mountains of West Virginia whose patriarch claimed to be a doctor specializing in life extension, a commune in the forests of the Pacific Northwest where visitors reported seeing people who appeared to be dead participating in daily activities. None of these accounts can be definitively linked to the Halberts. Yet, the pattern is suggestive. If to America, Magnus and his family, both living and preserved, did come, they seem to have continued their nomadic existence, perhaps staying in each location only as long as they could avoid unwanted attention. The most recent chapter in this strange saga may be the most disturbing of all. In 2010, to a grim discovery, a fire at a remote farmhouse in rural Maine led. After extinguishing the blaze, which had destroyed most of the structure, a hidden cellar containing what was initially believed to be a mannequin workshop was found by firefighters. Further investigation revealed that the mannequins were in fact human remains in various states of preservation. Most had been damaged in the fire, but that some of the bodies had been preserved for decades was determined by forensic examination, with the oldest potentially dating back to the early 20th century. Most disturbing was the discovery that some of the more recently deceased individuals showed signs of having been artificially preserved while still alive. That they had continued to move and function in some capacity for months or even years after the preservation process had begun was suggested by evidence. No residents of the farmhouse were ever found, either among the remains or elsewhere. The property had been purchased 20 years earlier by a cash buyer using what proved to be a false identity. That the occupants kept to themselves and were rarely seen up close was reported by neighbors, though they occasionally observed what appeared to be a family of 5 through the windows, an older couple, 2 middle-aged individuals, and a younger person of indeterminate gender. That the farmhouse contained numerous books and journals related to obscure preservation techniques, experimental chemistry, and fringe theories about extending life beyond death was noted by investigators. Among these materials was a family tree that, while partially burned, included the name Halbert near the top. On the remains, DNA testing proved inconclusive, with unusual chemical alterations to the cellular structure that prevented standard identification methods noted by analysts. The case remains open, classified as a multiple homicide with no named suspects. Could this be the final chapter in the Halbert saga? In that fire in Maine, did their centuries-long journey end? Or once again did they escape, perhaps leaving behind only their oldest and most deteriorated family members as they fled into the night? The truth may never be known. But for a family whose very existence challenged the boundary between life and death, between history and legend, perhaps that uncertainty is fitting. What we can say with some confidence is that the story of the Halberts, whether viewed as historical fact, elaborated folklore, or cautionary tale, something primal in our collective psyche touches. To our fear of death, it speaks, our reluctance to part with those we love, and the terrible consequences that might arise from defying the natural order. In a modern world where science continues to push the boundaries of what is possible, where cryonics promises to preserve our bodies for future revival, where transhumanists speak of uploading consciousness into machines to achieve a kind of immortality, perhaps a necessary warning is served by the tale of the Halberts. Some boundaries, it suggests, are not meant to be crossed. Some doors, once opened, cannot easily be closed again. And so to whatever fate ultimately claimed them, we leave the Halberts, or to their continued wandering if they somehow endure. A disturbing footnote in the annals of the macabre remains their story. A reminder that some family traditions are best left unpreserved. As for Magnus himself, the man who began this terrible legacy, perhaps exactly what he set out to accomplish he achieved, a family that would never be separated by death, that would remain together through the long centuries, unchanging even as the world transformed around them. Whether that represents triumph or tragedy depends, I suppose, on how one views the nature of life, death, and what might exist in the shadowy territory between. Sleep well, dear viewers, and perhaps tonight, with special care, check the locks on your doors. After all, the Halberts, or whatever they have become, may still be out there somewhere, moving stiffly through the night, searching for new additions to their eternal family. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Until next time, remember, not all histories are meant to be unearthed, and some families keep secrets that should remain buried, even if they themselves never will be. But wait, before you go, one last detail with you I feel I should share. During the production of this episode, something unusual occurred. From an unlisted number, strange phone calls were reported received by several members of our research team. When answered, for several seconds, the caller remained silent before speaking in what was described as a mechanical, halting voice. The message was always the same: we are still here. We are still together. Family is forever. The calls were unable to be traced by our technical team, and for how the caller obtained the private numbers of our researchers, we have no explanation. Of course, an elaborate prank by someone who learned of the episode's subject matter. It may be nothing more than. Nevertheless, to remain vigilant, I've instructed my team, and at our studio, additional security measures have been installed by us. A simple precaution, nothing more. And with that, I truly will bid you good night. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of history's most disturbing family legacies. If anything, the Halberts have taught us that some traditions are best left in the past, and that sometimes the greatest act of love we can offer those who have passed on is letting go. Until our next exploration of the shadows, where history and horror intersect, this is the Ghastly Journal, reminding you that the past is never truly dead, and sometimes in the most literal sense, it refuses to be buried. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting our channel. Into history's darkest corners, your contributions help us continue our research and bring these forgotten stories to light. And if you have suggestions for future episodes or perhaps knowledge of other historical horrors you believe deserve exploration, we welcome your comments below. Now, I really must go. Outside the studio all evening, a strange car has been parked, and I've just noticed that its occupants don't seem to be moving at all. Probably nothing to worry about, but in this line of work, to be cautious, one learns. Good night, and remember, some family reunions are best avoided. As I conclude this tale, about the nature of legends and how they evolve over time, I find myself wondering. The story of the Halberts, with its blend of historical elements and folklore embellishments, how our deepest fears can take narrative form exemplifies. Whether you view their story as a gothic horror tale or a reflection on humanity's complex relationship with mortality, one thing remains certain: the idea of defying death's finality will continue to fascinate and disturb us in equal measure. Perhaps that's why the Halbert story endures. To something universal, it speaks, our desire to hold on to those we love even when we know we should let them go. In their refusal to bury their dead, an extreme manifestation of grief's denial stage is represented by the Halberts, frozen in perpetuity. The boundaries of what constitutes death continue to be pushed by modern medicine. Brain death, clinical death, cellular death, these terms suggest that dying is not a moment but a process. Ever more blurred grows the line between life and what comes after. In this context, not merely as a madman, but as a terrible pioneer might Magnus Halbert be viewed, venturing into territories where science now treads with greater caution, but similar curiosity. What becomes of a family that cannot let go? What happens to love when it refuses to accept its natural conclusion? At the heart of the Halbert saga are these questions, questions that remain relevant regardless of whether one believes in the literal truth of their story. And so with this final thought, I leave you. The next time you find yourself unable to let go of something that has reached its natural end, be it a relationship, a phase of life, or even a loved one who has passed on, remember the Halberts. Remember that sometimes the most loving act is not preservation but release. Sometimes the most honorable thing we can do for our dead is to bury them properly and allow ourselves to move forward, carrying their memory rather than their physical remains. They're dead, the Halberts never buried, and in doing so, something essential about what it means to be truly alive they may have lost. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Good night, and may your own family traditions bring comfort rather than horror. A note by one of our producers: I've just been handed It seems an unusual package at the studio we've received, a small leather-bound journal with no return address. The last journal of Charlotte Halbert, continued, reads simply the accompanying note. What appears to be aged parchment covered in faded handwriting is inside. That our team is currently verifying its authenticity, I'm told, and if appropriate, in a future episode, its contents we may share. Until then, sleep well and remember to check under your bed for any family members who may have overstayed their welcome.